Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
Paddy in the studio.
And Henry at home.
And if you're watching, this is the Sunday edition of Newscast, which is new on the TV.
And I think, chaps, the main thing we're going to talk about today is trust in politics, which is something that people talk about a lot, very earnestly and occasionally pompously. But the reason to talk about it today is that the big focus group project that we did, Britain in a Room, which we talked about yesterday but was on the telly today, did raise a really central theme. Does the public think that politicians can actually get anything done?
Does changing them bring change?
Yeah.
The system is broken.
Yeah. And I think, as I said yesterday, and we discussed a lot on BBC One this morning, is there is a mood in the country at the moment that whichever politician it is, they're not really offering anything that can actually get stuff done.
Henry, do you think this is something to do with changing prime ministers more times than socks?
That's surely part of it. I mean, it certainly feels like public trust in politics generally has got worse over the last few years. But, you know, I don't think that began in, was it 2022 when the Conservatives had so many prime ministers? I can't even remember now. You know, it certainly was accelerated by Brexit because, you know, roughly half of the country was upset with the outcome. But then among those who were happy with the outcome, they were frustrated by the way in which the outcome was delivered and all that parliamentary wrangling and all of that. But then you could go back even further and say that the fact that the UK voted to leave the European Union, even though the vast majority of the political establishment, for want of a better phrase, wanted the UK to stay, was itself a symptom of declining trust in politics and politicians. So I don't really know if there is one easy single cause or point at which this problem began. And I think it is uncontroversially a problem. But certainly, you know, it's in a bad state. And that's something I know lots of politicians I talk to are very aware of and worried about.
They are worried about it. I mean, they really, really are worried about it. And if you look at the polling where the drops came, particularly in the Tories, were Partygate, drop, Liz Truss blows up the financial markets, drop. And those are the sort of two key polling moments. But what we've been doing this weekend is really trying to get into people's minds in terms of the focus group. We had Nadine Dorries, the former cabinet Conservative minister, on the programme this morning. And she told us actually that she's very worried about the state of the nation and actually her belief that it's worse than our focus groups were suggesting.
I think it's worse even than probably your focus group demonstrated. It's people are just the apathy, they've had enough. And they're dealing with real life problems. And sadly, we have failed them as a government due to our own internal warfare, which has taken place over the last 5 years. They're really seriously worried about cost of living.
Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Nadine Dorries is no fan of Rishi Sunak, right? Let's be upfront about that. She's very cross that her party removed Boris Johnson. She thinks it was all a terrible disaster. However, it is quite something for somebody who was a Conservative minister for a long time to sit and openly say, we have failed the country. We have been talking amongst ourselves. We haven't got things done and it's on us. Because that's basically what she was saying. She wasn't saying, oh, it's all terribly difficult because Ukraine and energy prices and things that are real factors. She was basically saying the Conservatives, of which she is a member, have failed the nation.
What do you think this is going to mean for the Conservative Party? Because one of the things that Nadine did do was write a book called The Plot.
She did.
Is it really credible, Henry, that there is another plot of the kind Nadine's writing a book about and wants us all to mention?
Well, I think plenty of people would say that Nadine Dorries' initial plot that she describes in her book is not itself credible, let alone this continuation of it. Clearly, she's right that a lot of Conservative MPs wanted Boris Johnson to be removed as Prime Minister and then removed him as Prime Minister. And the question that's occupied Westminster this week is how many Conservative MPs want Rishi Sunak to be removed as Prime Minister. Obviously, we saw Sir Simon Clarke go over the top and call for Rishi Sunak's resignation at the start of the week. Publicly, he was not joined by anyone. Privately, there's probably a few more, but not loads more Conservative MPs who
20?
agree with him.
20?
Sorry, go on.
20?
Well, I don't know. I mean, certainly those who say they do want to change think that's about the ballpark. Obviously, that's way short of what would be needed to remove Rishi Sunak. But the biggest concern, I think, for Rishi Sunak in terms of staying in his position is that Simon Clarke was making two arguments. One was that the Conservative Party is headed for an electoral iceberg, as he memorably put it. And two, that therefore the Conservative Party should remove Rishi Sunak. Almost no Conservative MPs I spoke to this week disagreed with Simon Clarke's first point. They only disagreed with his prescription that changing leader would improve the situation. And that means that Rishi Sunak's position, I think, is still a bit more fragile than it appears, even though Simon Clarke ended up looking very isolated.
And there are by-elections to come.
Local elections
in May. And the thing is, whether politicians like it or not, and Kemi Badenoch, the business secretary who was on with us this morning, does not like it at all, but whether they like it or not, they are all themselves, maybe not all, obsessed with the plotometer. Where is this? Who's up? Who's down? Who's in? Who's out? Who's positioning themselves for the leadership? Who's actually kind of given up? Who is it? Which former advisor has gone off and is having secret meetings in an office in the West End near an Italian restaurant where they may or may not have had a meeting to plan the plot? And I think the Conservatives at the moment, they seem kind of addicted to this stuff. It's running through their veins. So whenever something goes wrong for Rishi Sunak, they're going to bounce back into that situation where it all becomes this sort of frenzied situation, even though it seems at the moment this plot on the plotometer, such as it is, seems to be about 11 people, right? We're not talking about back in the days of Theresa May, for example, when you had the European Research Group, more than 80 strong, with lots of people involved trying to get Theresa May out in a very concerted, organised fashion. It seems to me we are not remotely in that place.
Which Steve Baker later apologised for,
indeed.
saying it had driven him to the wall.
That's absolutely right.
I was plotter-in-chief, he said. Kemi Badenoch, of course, we'll hear from herself, by the way, a former leadership candidate, out on many programmes saying, calm down, dear, to her Conservatives. And here she is. Let's have a listen.
One person wrote an article saying that he was unhappy. I called him after that and asked him what on earth he was doing, because this is exactly the sort of thing that we have to stop doing in public. We can have private discussions about what is going wrong. And I actually think it is healthy for us to have a debate. For there to not be a debate is unhealthy.
So, I mean, I'll just bring this together. It seems a bit presumptuous because you interviewed her. But, Henry, the link is the public doesn't really like plots.
Yeah, so we're told, but also, I guess if Simon Clarke was here, he'd say the public doesn't really like Rishi Sunak, and that therefore it's his sort of obligation as a Conservative to plot. I mean, Kemi Badenoch, I think, could not have been firmer today. There was no hint of a suggestion of a flicker of a sort of come and get me plea to the rebels at all. She was adamant that she supports Rishi Sunak. And to be fair, it's never sort of been imputed to her that she is part of these whispers around Rishi Sunak's leadership. It's more that the question is often then to people like Simon Clarke, OK, well, who would you replace the Prime Minister with? And that's when people say, not that Simon Clarke has said this publicly, but people then sort of turn to Kemi Badenoch. I mean, I think some people who I've been speaking to this week, Conservative MPs who would like her to become leader of the Conservative Party at some point, would prefer her to renew the Conservative Party in opposition, because I can't stress enough, that is the assumption of every Conservative MP, that they're headed for opposition, rather than become Prime Minister for a few months before what they assume is a defeat.
But why, if people haven't been following every twist and turn of this in Westminster, just say she put a real line in the sand down today, saying she has nothing to do with this. And that's important because many people in Westminster do point a finger at her. She would say that's unfair. She said any real friend of hers would never indulge in that kind of stuff because they care about her. But what was interesting, though, actually, just after the programme, somebody, a colleague of hers, messaged me to say that the key line was when at the beginning she said we need more hope and optimism.
Yeah, well, we've discussed this on this podcast.
But that is, although as Henry says, she wasn't having a go at Rishi Sunak, she was very firmly behind him. She did, though, give that nudge to say we maybe have to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, because it's as we keep discussing, the message of hope is the one that the voters say they really want. They want to hear a reason to go into the ballot box, because the biggest problem for Labour will be if people think there's no point voting. There's no point having a lead in the opinion polls if people then don't go and vote because they think the system's broken. I think that in preparation for meeting you two, and just a word, because we're new on the TV at this time, which is
so we better sit up straight.
Well, yeah, but it's the wash-up from the Sunday show. So you're both telling us, you're both experts in this field. She's messaging on the strongest possible way on the Sunday shows, don't put my fingerprints on this petty plot.
Exactly.
We want to say that, we want to nail that as wash-up. Mm-hmm. But in preparation for meeting you two, I was reading Tony Benn's diary on the 1990 plot to oust Margaret Thatcher. Mm-hmm. And the way that the momentum gets going surprised him. And one of the iconic figures of politics of the 20th century was watching another party's meltdown, and it surprised him the moment that the candidates changed. Because, Henry, you've told us this before, quoting Boris Johnson, when the herd moves.
That's right. And I do think the two moments that Laura identified earlier, the by-elections in February and the local elections in May, are big moments for Rishi Sunak to see whether Simon Clarke does become part of a herd that is moving or whether he remains isolated in public at least. Particularly because, and this is something we're increasingly being discussed in Westminster, because they will give a sense of how the Reform Party is doing, which is the party that Nigel Farage is sort of a part of, though there's a question of how prominently he wants to be a part of it in this election year. But one of the things that's been new in the last few weeks and months for Conservative MPs watching the polls closely is that the Reform Party seems to be inching upwards and upwards. Now, that has not been replicated in any local elections, by-elections, anything like that. But if in those February by-elections, especially in Wellingborough, which is Peter Bone's former seat, the other by-election is in Kingswood on the outskirts of Bristol, especially in Wellingborough, if Reform Party does well, or as one plotter is the right word for it, said to me this week, if the Reform Party does better than the Conservatives and beats the Conservatives into third place, now that seems fanciful to many, but that's one thing being discussed, then that would throw a lot of the focus back onto Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, and one of the worst moments for Theresa May was when the Brexit Party, as was, beat the Tories in the European elections, and that was one of the big triggers. Now, Keir Starmer was also something that our focus group voters talked about a lot. And if you haven't seen the programme or you haven't heard the clips, which we played some of them yesterday, there was really a distinct lack of enthusiasm. So the polls suggest Labour's somehow, going to smash it at the next election. That was not the mood of the room at all. And this morning, Jonathan Reynolds, one of Keir Starmer's top team, was out, and we made the politicians, they listened to the focus group, so they had to respond directly to the voters this morning. And one of the things I asked him is what we heard from people again and again is not just that they're not excited about him, but also he changes his mind. They're not quite sure what he stands for. So we put that to Mr Reynolds this morning.
No one is complacent because we know where we are coming from to do that. And you've got to have the self-awareness to acknowledge an opposition. You've got to keep making the case, keep doing that. People only tune in a little bit to oppositions, I think, when you get closer to an election. But look at the progress that has been made to date.
Keir Starmer was on Radio 4 with me a few weeks ago. And to voters who say they don't know what he stands for, actually, I think Keir Starmer's fans and supporters would say, well, actually, he stands for this. He had to clear up discipline in the Labour Party. He had to deal with the problem of anti-Semitism. He had to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn, which is not that you can tell where he stands on Jeremy Corbyn now very clearly. Then he had to go about his business of calling for a programme for government. And we know that Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell, two architects of the 97 victory, said he needed to get to that point quickly this year. He's been boosted by some massive by-election victories, to give it the official psephological term. And actually, it's all very well, these voters saying they don't know what it stands for, but the election could be 10 months away. So.
Well, it could. And there is a huge amount of Labour policy out there, actually. There are documents upon documents upon documents upon documents about his various missions. The point, though, is that voters haven't really cottoned on to it yet in great numbers.
And it's not doorsteppable. Some of the stuff can't be put in a sentence. But he did come out and make it plain he wants Conservative voters. He praised the status of Margaret Thatcher a month ago, Henry, and he's making it plain if he's going to win, he's got to eat Conservative majorities.
Can I give you both one of my favourite political trivia questions? And I promise it does have a point, which is the question of which Prime Minister won the most votes in any general election ever? Which Prime Minister won the most raw votes?
Was it John Major?
It's John Major in 1992.
Wow.
More people voted for John Major in 1992 than voted for Tony Blair in 1997. In fact, turnout fell quite a lot between 1992 and 1997. Now, look, clearly Tony Blair, if you look at the polls, Tony Blair was more popular than Keir Starmer is now. So there clearly was more enthusiasm for Tony Blair as an opposition leader in the run-up to the 1997 general election than there appears to be for Keir Starmer now. But I do sometimes wonder whether the sort of famous photos of people waving union flags as Tony Blair arrived in Downing Street, and by the way, they were Labour activists, slightly gives a full sense of what a landslide victory for the Labour Party, or indeed for any party, looks like. And certainly that's what Keir Starmer's team are hoping, because they're very aware of the problem or of the reality that he's not being carried into Downing Street on a sedan chair, even if the polls do suggest that as it stands he could be on course for a pretty
Talking of
victory.
being carried into Downing Street on a sedan chair, I once saw the diagram that New Labour, very much New Labour, had prepared for Tony Blair's walk into Downing Street that morning. And you can see that they had sketched out where they would have the line of activists all waving flags and looking happy and smiling, and then where Tony Blair and Cherie Blair would walk along and what the camera shots would all look like. And it was unbelievably carefully choreographed. And some of the shots make it look like there were these enormous crowds, and actually the line was sort of 2 or 3 deep. But good politicians, and I've seen this myself a million times, good politicians, whenever there are cameras there, they get out of the car and they go a cheery wave.
I love the wave.
And I've seen them do it a million times when there's no one
nobody
there.
there. No,
but
this
there's a camera there. Who says we should be cynical?
And turn it the other way around. No, I mean, it's very much like my social life, actually, waving
Is it?
to people who aren't there.
But you plan it in advance. You have a little diagram.
No,
I will arrive,
but I
someone will
remember-
hand me a martini, and I will greet my fans.
This moment I remember well, partly because of the Don't Stop of the Things Can Only Get Better anthem, which was played several times. And I was there when Bill Clinton was nominated. And
What a name dropper.
Well, no, I wasn't. It wasn't like I was, on the stage with him. But I was watching it happen in Madison Square Gardens, and I counted the number of times they played "Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow," because that was and New Labour was very influenced by the Clintonian win. And that whole moment, now that you're evoking it for me, I also remember it with music. And it's strange because I know that sounds a bit trivial, but it was about trying to make us all feel we're part of a change moment. We're part of a theatrical spectacle moment of change. I feel the hand of history on my shoulder, do I not?
And the finger of fudge. Have I told you that story?
No, that really
It's a
took
great
me by
story.
surprise.
Well, I'll tell you that another time.
No, you've got to tell us now.
OK, so apparently I was told at that press conference where Tony Blair was talking about the Good Friday Agreement and said, "This is not a time for sound bites, but I hear feel the hand of history on my shoulder." Allegedly, a wizened journalist of many years' experience in Northern Ireland muttered under his breath at the back of the room, "And the finger of fudge." Anyway, talking of sort of politicians who become celebrities, which Tony Blair and Bill Clinton certainly did, what about celebrities who could become politicians? So we had a bit of fun with our voters at the end of our long and fascinating discussion.
Jürgen Klopp.
Well, I was just about to ask you, if you had to, we asked them if they had to pick a Prime Minister who's not currently in politics, who would it be? Now, Nadine Dorris picked Jürgen Klopp in the studio this morning, but this is who some of our voters suggested.
If you could pick anybody, politician or not, to run the country, who'd do the best job at running the country, who would that be? At running the country?
Would be an absolutely brilliant Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
Alex Ferguson.
Alex Ferguson, OK.
Alan Sugar, because he wouldn't take any nonsense from the boardroom.
I would say Martin Lewis.
Martin Lewis.
Oh, yeah.
Martin Lewis.
Martin.
Oh, yeah.
I would like Martin Lewis.
Yeah, I like Martin Lewis.
Martin Lewis.
Martin Lewis, absolutely, yeah. He's got a grip of everything going on.
He's very good, isn't he? He'd make a good Prime Minister.
Martin Lewis himself has tweeted, "Apparently I was the choice of voters on BBC Law OK to be PM. That's flattering, thank you very kindly, but I'd rather wire my nipples to electrodes. Our system is overly adversarial, mandating politicians to lie and sell policies they disagree with. in order to hold the party line. This is Martin Lewis, very disillusioned already.
Very disillusioned.
Because he sort of was expected to go to the Lords. There could be something behind that, couldn't there, Henry? He thought he might get into the House of Lords, Martin Lewis.
Is that right? I don't know about that, but certainly people in Laura's focus group had a higher station in mind for him. I mean, I think one thing I took from that is if the UK ever abolished the monarchy and had elections for president, Martin Lewis would walk it. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting in the tweet Martin Lewis has done about this, one of his complaints about politics is that it's structured with an official opposition designed to oppose for the sake of it. But it does kind of show that politicians can't have it both ways. If you had a much more consensual kind of politics with major parties agreeing much more, you would have a whole other group of critics saying this just shows that there's a much too narrow range of opinions in Westminster, cosy Westminster consensus, so on, so on. He also questions, the fact that politicians have to toe a party line. But if they didn't have to toe a party line, if there wasn't a party whip system, you would have the kind of chaos that all the voters in the focus group, internal divides that the voters in the focus group abhorred. So I do think it just shows there are no easy solutions here to problems with politics and our political system.
Yeah, it's also designed, is it not, to have a government in waiting. It's designed to give people time to learn their brief, time to be briefed by the civil service as well when necessary. I said I'd mention this figure down here over your left shoulder, Henry. Jurgen Klopp was picked by Nadine Dorries. Who's that footballer in the Liverpool colours there? Who's that?
Yeah, that's my little shrine to Steven Gerrard, who will not be succeeding Jurgen Klopp as Liverpool manager, even though a couple of years ago that looked plausible.
I mean,
or as Prime Minister, by the way.
This succession is, to many members of the public, just as big as the prime ministerial
Absolutely,
plotting.
yeah.
The Jurgen Klopp shock
Yeah.
should have been a political edition of this podcast. We should have done the Klopp shock and the Rishi plot as one item.
Can you say that after you've...
I'm never going to say it again. And actually, funnily enough, neither will anyone else. Now, I want to tell you that I was chagrined. I read thousands of emails a week from listeners.
Yes.
And one of them wrote, because we interviewed Ken Clarke and Margaret Beckett on Broadcasting House a few weeks ago, and they said the abuse in politics is too much. It's driving people away. And one of our listeners is a councillor in Surrey, and she said, this is happening to me. I'm an independent. I'm quitting. And this is what she said.
How fed up am I? I'm at my wit's end with it. It's, for me personally, it's been about 3 years of low level, I mean, not death threats, but, pretty nasty emails at first, that just left me open-mouthed because they're so nasty. And now it's got worse in the last three years. And it's not just me. I was coming in this morning on the train and I was looking at somebody writing something on Twitter about our mayor, who's raising money. And it's just extraordinary. I don't get it.
And are you going to stay in local politics?
No.
And we also spoke to the former Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, chair of the Joe Cox Foundation. Henry and Laura, and this is sort of your territory, does it feel that the tone is ratcheting up? It's going to be an ugly election year, Henry? And, there's 28 recommendations from the Joe Cox Foundation wanting change across the board, including parties should educate candidates what to expect at election time, and social media companies need to do more. What do you hear from MPs?
It definitely feels like the abuse that MPs receive has got worse and worse over the sort of eight or so years that I've been talking to them. It comes up more and more often. Often MPs, by the way, don't want to go public about the extent of it, partly because they find it difficult to talk about, partly because they fear that would make it worse, and partly because for security reasons they don't want to talk about the mitigations that they have in place.
And this is where you both began our episode, which was the cynicism. Cynicism allied to being rude to politicians. And we want to keep stressing on Newscast that the bulk of politicians go into this for the best possible reason.
Well, I believe that they do. I think also it is quite easy sometimes to think, the good old days, everything was genteel and lovely. If you go back and you read things that were written in the 18th century, people enjoy being rude about politicians. However, certainly in the last kind of 8 to 10 years, and you probably think it started getting bad in this country around the time of the Scottish independence referendum, 2014, is followed then by the Brexit referendum. And of course, the massive tensions inside the Labour Party in the Corbyn era, that had some extraordinary levels of nastiness in between different factions in the party. And then, you know, it happened around Brexit, obviously, all those divisions that were in there in plain sight. I think it's ghastly. I think it's concerning. It definitely puts people off who are good people who might otherwise want to come into politics, particularly, not only, but particularly women with families. However, my own sense is, and this is not scientific at all, but my sense is actually since we had left the European Union and since the Labour Party isn't at each other's throats in the same way that they were, I think the level may have faded somewhat, but it is absolutely still there. And who knows what it will be like in another election year. And as I stress, that's not scientific. I'm not saying it isn't a problem. It absolutely is a problem. But I do think having two relatively conventional party leaders like Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer has dialed down the tone a little bit in Westminster.
It does feel like we've reached the end for many reasons. We're completely out of material.
Oh, no, you know we could go on for much longer. But for the people either listening or indeed watching on the BBC News channel, which is happening now, so welcome if you've been watching us on TV, that is probably enough for now.
Goodbye.
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 Newscast from the BBC.